He's an associate professor and director of exercise science and the Human Performance Lab in the Division of Athletic Training, Health and Exercise Science at Long Island University in Brooklyn. He has over 15 years of teaching experience and investigates all kinds of issues relating to stress and cardiovascular fitness, with a particular interest in Parkinson's and other cardiovascular issues, right? Is that?
Yeah,
I tried
sounds
to
good.
shorten it a little bit.
Sounds good. I've never actually had my introduction read out to me in front of me. That was interesting. Okay, so you're being handed out some papers that I put together. The outline that you'll see is basically the same one that's on the other handout, but there's some other papers in there that I think will supplement this little talk. So first, I just want to thank Grandmaster Choi and Solomon for allowing me this opportunity to speak to you. This came about because I was getting acupuncture treatments, and as Grandmaster Choi was explaining meridians and nervous system, I was kind of like keyed into what he was saying. He said, "What do you do?" I told him, "I'm standing before you." So that's how this came to be. But what I wanted to talk about today was just briefly tell you a little bit about the benefits of cardiovascular fitness, what really happens from a physiological standpoint. So there may be some terminology you may not be familiar with. There may be some acronyms I may use that you don't know. Just please ask. And also I want to talk about some of the risks. So as I said before, they're fairly minimal, but they're definitely real, and I think we need to be aware of what those risks are. A lot of the data show that there are risks when it comes to exercise, but for the most part, most people benefit much more than they have problems with. So it's worth it to exercise because it does help with longevity, it does help with quality of life. Obviously, we see many benefits like weight loss, and we see decrease in levels of diabetes or more of a level blood sugar. We see decreases in blood pressure, and all of those things are great, but there are some risks that come along with that. So the first thing I'm going to do you mind if I just erase this? Or is there a paper towel? Yeah. My artistic ability is probably worse than my son's.
Can you use the black one? So we can see it on the camera.
Use the black one? Sure. Yeah. Okay. And I always tell my students this, that I'm going to make some drawings.
You erase everything?
Erase everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
He erased mine then too.
also, I can't reach that high on this. But anyway, so if we look at the heart, if you just look to this first diagram of the heart, is anyone familiar with this? You remember from anatomy class or anything? You remember pictures of the heart or maybe in health class? So the things that I want you to really focus on is that the heart is made up of 4 chambers. There are 2 upper chambers, and they're known as atrium, and there's 2 lower chambers, and they're known as ventricles. And if you were looking at a body like this would be the right side, and this would be the left side. So it becomes very, very important when we're starting to talk about disease. There are diseases of all of these chambers. You can have individual disease, you can have left-sided disease, you can have right-sided disease. So it really depends on what the symptoms are of the individual, can kind of key you into what's going on in the heart and where that disease is located. The other thing I want to point out too, and we'll talk about this just briefly, is that there are 4 major valves in the heart, and the valves become very important because they are responsible for blood flow. So if blood is not flowing properly in the heart, chances are, and we're talking in the heart, it's either coronary arteries, we talk about coronary artery disease, arthrosclerosis, and we also talk about valvular dysfunction. So if someone is actually, feeling tired, or maybe have you ever seen people who have edema or swelling in their legs? Often that's because the valves are not working properly and the return of blood is not actually coming back to the heart when it should be. So it's basically staying in the lower half of the body. These valves become really important, and again, Valves can be diseased. You've heard of mitral valve prolapse. We'll talk about that a little bit. Different stenosis or narrowing of the valve. Those things are real, and with exercise can become much more detrimental. So there are kind of contraindications or reasons you should not exercise if you have some of these conditions. Okay, if you look at the heart here, on the right side here, there's two, and I'm not going to make this a physiology class, I promise you, but if you look at the two, these blue, what look like pipes, these are the pipes that allow blood to flow back to the heart. If there's any kind of dysfunction in these pipes, they're called vena cava, but if there's any dysfunction there, then blood flow back to the heart is going to be impaired. And as Grandmaster Choi was talking about, blood flow back to the heart is extremely important because the heart is a pump, and we are made up of, thank you, of plumbing, basically. I mean, we have valves, we have pumps, we have vessels, right? So think of it as, I always tell my students, kind of think of it as a water tower, and a sink, and pipes. So if you have a water tower in a town, right, the water flows down here, like this, it comes out, it goes into a sink that has a faucet, right? We turn the faucet on, we get water. What happens if there's a break in the line? If there's a break in the line, the faucet doesn't work that well. So the idea is that if the heart here is the pump, and this faucet represents what we call capillaries, which is where gas exchange takes place, oxygen, carbon dioxide. If this sink is broken or there's a cut in this line, you're going to have an impairment in gas exchange. And what does that do? It looks like shortness of breath. It looks like fatigue. It looks like being tired all the time. It looks like swelling of the legs. Those kinds of things are real things that happen when we have impairment in our vessels. So, last thing about this picture is that the heart works as a pump, as we know, but it pumps to two different places. It pumps to our system, but it also pumps to our lungs. And what Grandmaster Choi said before about if you strung out the vessels, you know, you took them out and you just made one string, it would wrap around the world 2.5 times. The lung, believe it or not, our lungs are about this big. If you spread out all of that tissue, it would cover half of a tennis court. So that's pretty unbelievable. So you can imagine what goes on in that kind of little surface area, all of that gas exchange, all of those things happening. So then you can think of, well, okay, wait, if I smoke for 15 years and I smoke 2 packs a day, it's as if I smoked a pack a day for 30 years of my life. What does it do to that tissue in the lungs? Basically destroys it, and therefore breathing becomes much more difficult. Obviously, individuals get fatigued, they get sick in other ways. So the heart pumps to the system, to the circulation, but it also pumps to the lungs. And do you know what it gets from the lungs? Like what happens when the blood goes to the lungs? What happens in the lungs? Does anyone know? Why that's important? What? Yeah, so the blood gets oxygenated and comes back to the heart, and then the heart pumps it to the system. Okay, so if we're following the outline, again, these are some of the things in terms of benefits that we see. First is heart size. As Grandmaster Choi mentioned before, everyone has a different heart size, and the data show that women tend to have smaller hearts than do men, and children have smaller hearts, obviously, because their bodies are smaller. What do you think heart size has to do with circulation? Okay, so the greater the pump, or the greater the size of the pump, the more you can pump. But is that always a good thing? Is it always good to have a really big pump?
Has to work hard to pump to a larger area.
Okay, if you have a bigger body, yeah. So if you took the same size heart and you had a bigger body, for sure, yes, you'd have greater surface area. But what else? Like we hear about athletes having enlarged hearts. Well, if it follows that, if I have, here's the heart again, right? And here is the right side, here's the left side. This is the left ventricle, which is really the major pump of the heart. If this is out here, really big, really muscular, enlarged, is that a good thing or bad? I mean, it would stand to reason that you could pump more blood through, right? Well, why might that be bad?
It could burst the pipe.
Yeah, could increase the pressure.
Maybe it doesn't contract as effectively.
Yeah, after a while, this starts to get tired. It's as if you're taking a 20-pound dumbbell and you're just continuously lifting it. What ends up happening to your bicep? It just fatigues after a while.
Or this,
So,
or this.
or this, right? That was a perfect example, right? So when you're taking a pump and you're enlarging it to a certain degree is fine, to the extent that it can pump more blood, that's great. Once it gets too enlarged, it then can become diseased and dysfunctional and impaired. So many of the athletes that we see do tend to have enlarged hearts. Most of those athletes are sprint-type athletes. Cyclists are found to have enlarged hearts often. And it's because of the way they train that their heart is enlarged, because they are putting a stress on their heart on hills, in speed. They're asking their heart to do a lot of pumping very, very quickly over short distance. And that tends to enlarge the heart. And again, that can lead to impairment. The specific impairment it can lead to is congestive heart failure. So when this enlarges, what happens, or when it gets bigger, what ends up happening is the actual tissue starts to dilate. There's a change in the shape of the heart. It's no longer like a cone, it's more like a sphere. And a sphere does not pump as efficiently as a cone does. Okay? So heart size is really, really important. And just bringing up the children again, children have smaller hearts, they have smaller bodies, but believe it or not, children, you ever notice like how the kids in the class, they cannot stop moving, right? They can't stop moving. They're always moving and running around and whatever. Now you may think it's kind of attention issues, but it's also they need to keep their body going. The circulation is always moving. Try to do that and you'll completely exhaust yourself. If you ever look at a baby who's like constantly all over the place, that has to do with nervous system, but it also has to do with the fact that they can send oxygenated blood throughout their system a lot more efficiently than we can, even though they have smaller hearts. So their ability to exchange gases, carbon dioxide for oxygen, is a lot more efficient than it is as we get older. Okay? And that's more of a cardiovascular, I think, adaptation that they go through. Okay, second, has anyone ever heard of stroke volume before? Stroke volume? You have? Okay. So stroke volume is a measurement of the amount of blood that's ejected with each beat. Normally our stroke volume is somewhere around 70 milliliters or so. Just to give you an idea, to put it into context, you pump about 5 liters of blood through your circulation every minute. 5 liters pumps through. So stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out in each beat, right? We beat roughly 70 times a minute. So if you look at 70 milliliters times 70 beats, you get about 4,900 milliliters per minute that is pumped out. We also look at this as a percentage, and it's known as ejection fraction. But the reason this becomes important is this. Let's say you have somebody who is looking to start exercising, and they're an older individual, let's say 50s plus, and they maybe had a history of heart disease. What ends up happening is, once that heart is diseased, it's difficult to change it back to what would be considered normal. So the fraction of blood that's ejected out with each beat is lessened. Most of us sitting here eject about 65% of our blood out of our heart every single time it beats, leaving us with about 35% to kind of feed the coronary arteries. But someone like that who walks in may have an ejection fraction of 40 or maybe 30. And again, to put it into context, somebody with heart failure, and if you've ever seen someone with heart failure, they look fairly sick, may have an ejection fraction below 20. So it's important to understand that those types of individuals who may be doing exercise, or whether it be on a mat or outside or recreationally, need to be aware of their function, their heart's function. And stroke volume is a really important part of that. Okay? How does exercise change stroke volume? Number one is it makes our heart stronger. So with a stronger pump, not enlarged, but a stronger pump, you eject more blood out with each beat. That changes what's called the ejection fraction, and therefore oxygenates the entire circulation, sends more oxygen through the circulation. Okay, heart rate. Everyone know how to take their heart rate?
No.
If you don't, okay, so right here on the thumb side, you take 2 fingers, you're going to place it right below the thumb, right below the wrist, and you're going to hold it there. Most people can't really feel it right away, but if you have a nice strong beat, you should be able to feel it. What you're going to do is use the second hand, if you had one, and you're going to count how many beats you feel in 10 seconds. That's an easy way to do it. You can also do 15 seconds, 30 seconds if you want. There's 2 things that this does. Number 1 is it tells you how many times your heart beats per minute. Average, 72 beats a minute. Anywhere between 60 and 100, considered normal. Okay? Below 60 is good if you're an athlete, but if you're an older, frail individual, not so good, because it means that your heart is not beating strong. Over 100 at rest is fast. Heart doesn't need to beat that much. Okay? So average, again, roughly 70, anywhere between 60 and 100 is considered normal. If you think about it, and I was doing this calculation, 70 times per minute, right? Over the course of an hour is 4,200 times your heart beats an hour. And if you look over the course of a day, it's around 100,000 times. So kind of keep those numbers in your head. It's amazing that more things don't go wrong, right? So the second thing that this does is it can tell you a little bit about the rhythm of your heart. It should be love, dub, right? What if it's love, dub, love, dub? That's an irregular heart rhythm, right? And you can easily tell that that's happening at your wrist. And that might be something that an individual could check out, because it's not considered a normal beat. But why do you think that's so significant? It's not just the sound. What do you think this is really telling you? Yeah, but what's the problem? It's not just the fact that you're not feeling the beats normally. It's telling you something about the heart chambers or the valves. Yeah, so the pumping is asynchronous. It's like here, 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 here. It's not pumping as one unit like it normally does. Okay? So,
Plus one more thing.
yeah.
When you do like, we check out like 3 fingers. If you feel like something on your pulse and there was something feel like another one, like a very, very small, and have another one jumping on it, that's pregnant.
Oh.
Those are 2 different
Heartbeats.
lights.
Oh, right. Okay. Interesting. I've never had the pleasure of doing that, but that's interesting. Okay. The next term is something called cardiac output. We know what heart rate is, and we just learned what stroke volume is. You put them together, that's called cardiac output. So the output that I was talking about, the 5 liters per minute, we call that cardiac output. Just to give you an idea, ours is roughly 5 liters a minute. Lance Armstrong's somewhere around 6.5. So his heart is that strong, his circulation is that efficient, that he's able to circulate that much more blood throughout his system. Therefore, well, let's...
That's the drugs, though.
All right, let's take the performance enhancing drugs out of it. He still was a physiologic anomaly. But cardiac output is important too. And again, you know, if we exercise, whether it be, you know, in martial arts or we're doing something that is improving our circulation, we enhance our cardiac output. And that's really, really important because you're basically enhancing your circulation. But blood flow. So, I think Grandmaster Choi referred to arthrosclerosis, which is basically a narrowing of the vessels. Arthrosclerosis is a very, very common disease. Sometimes it gets to the point where an individual has a heart attack, and sometimes it doesn't. But believe it or not, the vessels start out nice and clean when you're born for the most part. And then as you age, at about the age of 10 years, you start to get what's known as foam cells. And why? Well, you can thank McDonald's and Burger King for that. Because chances are, 50, 60 years ago, when fast food wasn't as prevalent and the family dinner was much more commonplace, you probably weren't seeing this. Now we start to see this at 10 years. At about 30 years of age, these foam cells start to enlarge and plaques start to develop here. So you notice what's happening to the vessel, right? Vessel's narrowing. the amount of space in the vessel has diminished significantly. And then about the age of 50, that plaque starts to take up about 70% of the vessel, and what's left is that space for oxygenated blood. So what possibly could happen is there could be a rupture of the vessel that could basically open this entire space, and all of the contents of the vessel crosses the vessel and blocks it. People say, I have a 90% blockage, a 70% blockage, an 80% blockage. What they're talking about is this. And this is kind of the chronological look at how vessel disease happens. So by the time you are 50 plus, you've already had these plaques in there for years. And one way to improve this, and talking about blood flow, is exercise. So exercise has shown that by changing the anatomy of the vessel, we have these cells here called endothelial cells. And this is going to bring up something that I'm sure you're familiar with. There was Pfizer had a massive drug on the market for the last 15 years for sexual dysfunction. Do you remember what it was? Viagra, right? Viagra was found because these cells in the vessels secrete something called nitric oxide, not nitrous oxide, with the laughing gas that you get at the dentist, but nitric oxide. And nitric oxide helps to open up the vessel. So the more nitric oxide you can actually secrete, the more the vessel opens. These endothelial cells are stimulated. The endothelial cells are stimulated with exercise. So the more exercise you do, the higher the levels of nitric oxide, the more the vessel opens, the better the circulation. That's been proven in people with heart disease as well as people who are young and healthy. Okay?
What's the test you do to make sure it's not?
Good question. So how do you find out, right, if there's a blockage? One way is through a catheterization, right? And that is not fun. It's a procedure where they take a catheter and they stick it up the femoral artery and they bring it all the way up to the heart and they shoot dye in there and then they see how everything lights up. One way is a stress test. May give you some information, although we know that those can be false. And those are really, there are some non-invasive measures and scans that you can do, but they're fairly accurate, but they can only give you an idea of the amount of nitric oxide you have. They cannot give you a definite number. They can't quantify exactly what you have. But those are ways. Okay. Blood pressure and blood volume. You guys have had your blood pressure taken at the doctor, right? And what do they say? It's good, right? Did they ever tell you what the numbers are?
Yes.
Who? What? And would you mind sharing? All right, good.
110/70.
Okay. Did they tell you what the numbers mean?
No.
Okay.
It's systolic and I can't remember what.
Systolic and diastolic. Did they tell you what those mean? They just say what they are, right? Okay. So 110/70. So systolic just refers to the pumping action. So when the heart is physically pumping, there's 110, and it's measured in mercury, right? Because the mercury, the old mercury blood pressure cuffs, when mercury rises. So you're measuring it in mercury, and 110 is what the pressure is in the vessels when the heart is pumping. That's why it's actually higher always than the second number. The 70 is diastolic, and that's when the heart is relaxing. So you always want to have this number higher than this number. You never want to see it the opposite way, okay? But the other thing is, what if this number is 160 and this number is 100? What ends up happening is when you have your blood pressure taken, they get a very good look into your circulation and the amount of pressure against the artery walls when the blood is actually flowing through it. So if this is really high, do you know what this can lead to? Does anyone know what disease this can lead to? Not just heart disease, but specifically, people with high blood pressure have more susceptibility to stroke. Yeah. The pressure is so great that it can actually cause damage to the vessels. This number, when high, is a really major problem because when this is high, it means that there's a lot of pressure when the heart is actually retrieving blood. It should be relaxed, but it's not. So often what happens is if we're exercising an individual and their blood pressure starts to go up, we expect this to go up because the heart is pumping a lot faster when they're exercising, right? We don't expect this to go up. This should stay the exact same at 70, or it should even drop to roughly 65. If it goes up, it indicates that there's resistance when the heart is relaxing, and often what that can be is vascular disease in the periphery, specifically the legs if we're doing a bike test or a treadmill test. Okay. Sorry I'm going so fast. Blood volume. The director of our program, who is now left, was a USA karate coach for the Olympics. His name was Milorad Stričević. And he wrote a few books on karate, but his big issue was blood volume, in that exercise tends to increase blood volume levels. And I'll tell you how it does that and why that's important. So, exercise in and of itself will increase blood volume. And why is blood volume important? Because the greater the amount of blood volume you have, what do you think it does to your circulation? Yeah. So, yeah, it makes your circulation much more efficient, right? And the reason that they say there's an increase in blood volume due to exercise is because people who exercise tend to hydrate more, they tend to drink more water, and they tend to urinate less. You guys, you may not agree with that, but a lot of the data shows that, right? So when you're looking at an increase in blood volume, what happens to the levels of red blood cells? So if you have more water portion of your blood, the water portion of your blood is increased, what happens to the levels of red blood cells? It's diluted a little bit, right? But exercise can also increase those levels of red blood cells. It's just that now what you have is you have a nice, think of a street that's flowing with cars, never hitting a traffic jam. You're always hitting a light. You ever been like in Queens, you know, driving down Northern Boulevard, you're hitting the lights constantly? Constant flow. Whereas when you decrease your blood volume, what happens to the red blood cells then?
Traffic jam.
Traffic jam. That's exactly right. There's a traffic jam. Yeah. There's too many red blood cells for the amount of water in the blood. So an increase in blood volume, due to the fact that we hydrate more, we urinate less, and because we urinate less, we hold on to, I know we didn't put a lot of salt in the food today, but we hold on to sodium. And why is sodium so important? Because sodium retains water. So if you think about it, when you're, you ever been outside on a really hot day and your fingers swell? Often what's happening is you're holding on to salt. And why are you holding on to salt? Your body is trying to prevent itself from dehydrating in the heat. After a while, you'll start to lose the salt and you'll start to dehydrate if you don't, continue hydrating yourself. But at least the absorption of salt is increased when we exercise or if we're trained, and blood volume goes up, which causes a kind of a nice flow of blood and real efficient circulation. Okay, great stuff. Exercise is amazing. You know, obviously we're all big believers in it. We do it to various extents. However, there are some drawbacks, and these are the drawbacks. Rhythm disturbances. Okay, has anyone ever felt a skip beat?
No.
Yeah? A lot often? Not often?
I had a real problem with it for 4 years.
For how long?
4 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Did they know what?
I had a lot of tests done.
Was it diagnosed?
Oh, yes. There was something in the left and the right, but I don't remember exactly what she said.
Okay.
And then it went away.
Okay.
So now it's just periodic, like once every couple days. But I mean, it was like 60, 70 times a day.
Really? Would happen that often? All right. So, quick lesson on EKGs. Just very quick. In EKG, has anyone ever had that done where you can stick the electrodes on? Okay. All it basically is it's a picture of your heart from different angles. Okay, from different angles. So basically it's camera angles from the left, the right, the top, and the bottom, taking a picture of the heart, but giving you an idea of what the rhythm is, right? And normally KG kind of looks like this. This is what the normal rhythm looks like. So a doctor will look at this and say, everything looks great. But if you start to see this, there's a problem here. And each one of these little waves here tell you about a different part of the heart. We're not going to go into that, but suffice it to say that if you look at a particular waveform, you can tell almost exactly what location that problem is in. Okay? So, skip beats. Let's just go with that. Skip beats are actually quite common in athletes. They often suffer from skip beats. And we call them, if we take that picture of the heart again, and we call these the ventricles, right? Skip beats often happen here in the ventricle. But there's really nothing to worry about unless you're getting 6 in a row. You're getting 6 skip beats in a row, you're definitely going to feel it. You're either going to feel short of breath, you're going to panic, but circulation will definitely be affected. But if you get 1 skip beat here or there, it's not going to matter. You just feel it, and then your heart goes back to the normal rhythm. So the major rhythm disturbances are not just the skip beats, because they don't really mean anything. It's when there's a problem in the actual wave, either the shape, the size, or the amplitude, meaning the height. That's when you start to see major problems. Obviously, we're not doing EKGs here, so we're not going to know if someone is having an issue like this. However, an easy way to find out is just to feel their pulse. Because if you feel their pulse and you start to have a regular rhythm, and they're not pregnant, you will actually start to, if you did an EKG, you'd probably be able to pick it up. Okay?
Is this arrhythmia?
Yeah. An arrhythmia is a dysfunctional rhythm. That's exactly right.
And I was diagnosed with that
What? Which?
arrhythmia
Like what?
in college. That was 20 years ago.
Okay.
So is that something that can go away?
Yes.
Okay.
Were you stressed at the time?
College?
Yeah. I mean, stress can bring it on. Definitely. There are certain types of arrhythmias that are much more serious than others, but yes, stress can definitely bring on. And I have students of mine who have come to me, oh, I have skip beats and this and that. Yeah, so college is definitely a good environment for that. Valve abnormalities, all right? So we have our 4 valves. Our valves can be narrowed. They can actually be what's called regurgitant, meaning blood flow goes down one way but comes up the other way. Has anyone ever, you've heard of mitral valve prolapse? So all mitral valve prolapse is if you have a valve, which is basically leaflets, right? They're just these kind of leaflets that close. Normally they close so that blood flow is not allowed to go backwards. Mitral valve prolapse is kind of like that. So that blood flow actually moves back. Now, what can that do? Well, it can cause pain. And it can also, if severe enough, although a lot of people do live with mitral valve prolapse, can cause changes in function, right? Because if I'm not getting the blood flow that I need to get, or it's moving in the wrong direction, it's definitely going to affect my function. So valve abnormalities is something to look at. Size abnormalities, we talked about enlarged hearts. Has anyone ever heard of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy? Remember Eddie Curry played for the Knicks? You guys remember him?
He died?
I think he's still playing. He's still playing, but many of them have. This is a genetic abnormality that occurs due to just the heart enlarging to the point where it starts to fail. And Eddie Curry was an athlete who played for the Knicks who saw somewhere between 7 and 9 doctors until a doctor told him it was okay to play. Ended up playing. I think he's still playing, or he may not be playing in the NBA, but I don't think he's dead. But there have been many athletes who have died from that. So those things are really important to know. Stroke. There are 2 types of stroke. There's hemorrhagic stroke, which is like having a hemorrhage, where Grandmaster Choi talked about an aneurysm, which is a burst blood vessel. That can cause, well, obviously death, but if there's a burst or there's a hemorrhage, that could actually cause a hemorrhagic stroke, where you can have single-side paralysis, and other symptoms leading to death. But the other stroke is called ischemic stroke. And all ischemia means is a lack of oxygen. People say I have chest pain. We call that ischemic, right? So I just have a lack of oxygen,
You never have no
lack of
fresh action
function.
in their body.
Right, so, what Toga, going to the mountains, getting fresh oxygen. But stroke, ischemic stroke, is caused by a blood clot. So there are certain things that can lead to that. Hypertension is one, alcoholism is another. Smoking is definitely one that has been proven because it actually shrinks the blood vessels and can cause problems in circulation. But the other is known as, and this is what I was thinking about, when this 39-year-old guy dies 4 days after having a massive stroke, which, by the way, I was on the phone with him Monday before he had the stroke on Wednesday. He was the most articulate guy I've ever spoken to. And he's a software engineer, a smart guy, has a massive stroke on Wednesday and dies on Saturday. I'm thinking, what possibly could have caused that? And hearing about him, he didn't have any risks, he wasn't an alcoholic, he didn't have hypertension, he was fairly healthy. There is something known as an Atriovenous Malformation, which is basically a tangling of blood vessels in the brain, which on scan can be picked up, but there'd be no reason to scan an individual who is apparently healthy. And that's the only reason that I thought maybe this was a possibility. That would be an example of an ischemic stroke. How exercise relates to that is that the greater the amount of blood flow, so when you're really working hard, there's a tremendous amount of blood flow. If there's a clot that's developed somewhere, doesn't matter where it is, that clot can be sent anywhere. It can be sent to your brain, it can be sent to your lungs, it can be sent to your legs. Individuals who have clotting issues, and probably know they have clotting issues, are susceptible to that. An example, a friend of mine, who's my age, he's 46, had you've heard of a pulmonary embolus before? So it's a clot that moves to the lungs. He's 46 years old. He was hospitalized with 2 pulmonary emboli and what's known as a DVT, which is a deep vein thrombosis. Now, he's not the healthiest guy, but he's also not the most slovenly guy. He's actually very skinny, and he's just normally a healthy guy. His mom and his sister both had clotting issues. So there's a huge genetic predisposition to having that problem. Okay, the last 2 things to talk about are, and I know this is so morbid, I should have started with this. It's not as happy. Sudden cardiac death. This is, people, you had mentioned, right? Going to the bathroom is actually quite dangerous if you bear down. Reason being, you increase your blood pressure, but on the rebound, you decrease your heart rate. And by doing that, you really change your circulation. So going to the bathroom for older people and shoveling snow are 2 of the major events that can cause heart attacks, especially when there's an underlying problem that they're not aware of. Sudden cardiac death.
Medicine doctors will learn from our techniques a lot.
Right, exactly. Sudden cardiac death occurs in roughly 1 out of every 600,000 to 800,000 hours of exercise. So it is very, very rare, but it does happen. I don't know if you remember a guy by the name of Ryan Shea. He was an Olympic hopeful training in Central Park. He was 29 years old, and he went out to run with his wife, his friend, who was also a runner, and his wife. And he collapsed in Central Park. I don't know if you remember this. It probably happened around 7 or 8 years ago. He was 29. He died of sudden cardiac death. Interestingly enough, though, Ryan Shea was told not to train and not to compete because they knew he had a predisposition to this type of problem. He still did it and then ended up dying. So if you look at just the 3rd page, I'm going to end in just a moment, or the 4th page, I should say. There are these graphs that I pulled out of different research studies, and if you're interested in looking up the research studies, on the last page, all the references are there for you. If you have any questions, please feel free. But if you notice, the causes of sudden cardiac death, the major ones, 2 of them, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a diseased heart, and the other one is known as commotio cordis. And this was really, really interesting to me because of what we do. So commotio cordis just means commotion of the heart. And basically it's being hit with an object that needs to be moving roughly 30 miles an hour right in the chest. So if you look at this little tiny picture, I know you need a magnifying glass to see it. This is a hockey player who got hit with a slap shot, died on the ice at the basically a couple of seconds after he was hit. The reason is because when you look at this regular rhythm, this is an indication of pumping. So this part, or this phase, is where the heart is pumping. Remember, this is electrical, right? So the heart is pumping here. Here the heart's relaxing. In order to die from this commotio cordis condition, you need to be hit in the chest at the exact moment your heart is in relaxation. So it's milliseconds. I mean, it's got to be perfectly timed. But this is really an interesting statistic, is that the people who die of commotio cordis the most are people who play baseball, which I found to be really interesting. That martial arts doesn't really even fall on the scale. And hockey, obviously, but I think it's fairly rare to get hit in the chest at that exact moment.
Is baseballs that are just being dressed?
Yeah. Yep. Right. Just getting hit with a baseball, because chances are it's moving at that velocity, and you know.
Does that matter? Because, you know, that whole, like, this part is really much more, like,
Solid.
less solid.
Here.
You know, when I got kicked once here, I got the wind out.
Right. Right. But you're getting hit. Yeah. You have to get hit in. Look, you got to get hit. Here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Like on the muscle at the moment that the heart goes into relaxation. Yeah.
Now you're laughing.
So, lastly, getting back to the fun stuff, is that obviously we know exercise is good for us. The muscle adaptations that we've seen in the data that are coming out now are amazing. So, you guys have heard of high-intensity interval training? You know, Insanity, right? By the way, Insanity has now gone to 25 minutes of just high-intensity exercise.
It's a new one, right?
Yeah, I don't know what that's just called stupidity. I don't know what, I honestly don't know what they're trying to do there. But the idea of high-intensity interval training is intensity, then decrease. Intensity, then decrease with short bursts of intensity and then rest in between. And what they're finding, this is pretty amazing, is that even though the stuff that we do, where you're doing push-ups and then you're getting up and you're doing your double, you know, your 2-kick drill, then you're doing sit-ups, and then that's high-intensity interval training. But believe it or not, the changes that are going on in your muscle is that they're becoming more aerobic than anaerobic. So they're not becoming, the adaptation is that they're not more powerful necessarily, but there's more endurance. So you'll find that you'll be able to do that much easier and much more efficiently. So the data show that really that there are these molecular changes going on in the muscle when you go through high intensity interval training, if you do it the right way, that makes the muscle more aerobic than it does actually more powerful in that sense. And the last thing is cross training. And I was thinking about, as I was putting this outline together, that's what we do here, is cross training. Because we do a lot of different types of training. You know, there's kicking and there's punching, so there's upper and lower body. There's push-ups and there's sit-ups. There's, you know, kick drills. There's things that are slow. There's yin, there's yang, so it's very much cross-training. And I think the biggest advantage of cross-training is the fact that you're not overwhelmingly working one particular muscle group, like runners or other athletes who just work one thing. So when you look at triathlon, you know triathlon has become a tremendously popular type of event. There are people who go into triathlon, you know, all over the world who don't even look like, they don't look like they would be triathletes, but they do triathlon because they're swimming, biking, and running. So cross-training seems to be one of the best ways to get at the benefits that we were talking about. Outside of all the craziness that goes on and the bad things that can happen, exercise is obviously a good thing. It's obviously very beneficial for longevity and quality of life. So I want to thank you guys for